I'm so glad to have returning to Bad Faith Podcast for the second time, Heidi Matthews. She is a professor at York University Law School. Thank you for joining us again.
Thanks so much, Bree.
So the last time you were here, you were using your experience and your kind of knowledge base to talk about international law to really weigh in on claims that were reaching a fever pitch at the time about sexual assault that had happened on October 7th that had been described by the New York Times and other outlets as widespread. And around the same time, a number of outlets, principally Mondoweiss, The Gray Zone, the Electronic Intifada, had been doing a lot of work to kind of parse through the allegations. And we were talking a little bit about what is normal in war, to the extent that you can kind of talk about these things as, normal, what's usual, what is being described, what do people expect, and to the extent that claims are being made that aren't supported by facts and evidence, what are they doing? Like, how are those claims being weaponized? What purpose are they serving? Now, that was months ago. And I think there's been a lot of good reporting that has dramatically undermined that narrative, shall we say. And even mainstream outlets like the AP just this week came out detailing the extent to which two specific claims of sexual assault that had been claimed to have happened on October 7th have since been debunked. So before we get into newer news, which is the fact that the ICC has said it's pursuing these warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, I wanted to give you a chance to kind of weigh in on all that has happened on the kind of sexual assault front since you were last on the podcast.
Yeah, that's a good question. So you're right. I mean, I think like the general observation is that there has been a concerted effort to, I wouldn't say like investigate these claims in a legal sense, but, to investigate the reporting on the claims. And that was my concern all along, has been the way in which sexual violence allegations have been weaponized to justify the fact of the continuation of Israel's offensive on Gaza, but also like the manner in which that war is being waged. So, on the one hand, for those who are paying attention and who are kind of predisposed to be skeptical, really of U.S. and Israeli actions in Gaza, I think they're paying attention and recognizing that, we need to be very careful about how we talk about and how we sensationalize these claims in order to justify war, and I think now pretty clearly genocide from my own perspective. But, and I will say like this, looking at the context of the most recent news, the request for arrest warrants at the ICC, and watching over the last couple of days the response of the US, but also several other states, right? It's still the case that Israel and its allies are doubling down on sexual violence as a way to basically, again, further justify the continuation of the offensive in the face of all sorts of approaches that are being, mobilized to try and stop it, including the ICC, including the International Court of Justice, et cetera. So it still really is the go-to claim. Like, 2 seconds ago before I joined the call, the other thing in the news today is that Norway, Ireland, and Spain are recognizing the state of Palestine today. So that's a really big deal. Obviously a long time coming, but it's important news. And the response from Israel is to say that the ambassadors of those countries will be, I'm just reading now for the BBC, will be summoned for reprimand talks, during which they will be shown a video of the abduction of female soldiers on October 7th. Right. So yeah, we're still kind of where we were at in terms of the discourse.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I also just saw the kind of infamous Stop Anti-Semitism Twitter account, at Stop Anti-Semites. They tweeted out a photograph of Ireland Foreign Minister Michael Martin and his family. And they wrote, on October 7th, Hamas terrorists raped and kidnapped his daughter, Abby Martin, into Gaza. Today, Michael Martin announced he's rewarding his daughter's rapist with a state of their own. Lunacy, right? then why are you doing this, et cetera, et cetera. And then they did a follow-up tweet saying, this post is for illustrative purposes only and did not actually occur. Like, obviously, right? So they're tweeting out weird rape fantasies about an Irish foreign minister's daughter being raped to prove some kind of point about what they think the constructive effect of Ireland recognizing Palestine as a state is. I mean, it's really, it's twisted stuff. Now, obviously, that's just a Twitter account that's not associated with the Israeli government per se. But another thing that we've seen, and I'm trying to see if I can pull it up right now, is another kind of videos that have been released, which the allegation is so the video shows a bunch of IDF soldiers who are young women. It doesn't describe them as IDF soldiers. And it includes a translation, an alleged translation of what's being said in Arabic as these women are being taken as prisoners of war by Hamas. And what's alleged is that Hamas soldiers are saying these are girls that can get pregnant, and that another one of the soldiers says something about how beautiful one of the women is. And people have been rushing to push back, saying, well, the actual translation says absolutely nothing about anybody being pregnant. These are not civilians, that these are IDF soldiers. And that what one of the Hamas individuals says is, no, not beautiful, not that you are beautiful. Obviously, the insinuation being that if they, are saying how beautiful they think the captives are, that it's because they're about to sexually assault them. So yeah, this does seem to be maybe evidence that there's another ramping up of this narrative because of how things are souring for Israel on the international stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say too, like, I think, I'm not sure if we discussed this last time, I forget, but part of the, like, I think explaining the persuasiveness, I think about this a lot, but in terms of explaining the persuasiveness of these narratives, it really relies on, like, the eroticization of colonial violence in this context as well. So, it's a claim about what Hamas did, or what Hamas, and other militants might be likely to do to hostages, et cetera. But it's also, as you say, like, conjuring the fantasy of these kinds of atrocities in ways that are, truly disturbing.
Yeah. Well, Heidi, look, I reached out because as soon as the ICC warrant news broke, you did a really excellent thread that I think helped to contextualize what this does and doesn't mean. And I know that I had a lot of questions about it, especially initially, because when the ICJ started its proceedings and its investigations and its claims against Israel, there were people who pointed out, well, yes, of course, this is the ICJ doing this and not the ICC, the International Criminal Court, because everybody knows that the ICC only goes after the Global South. I think something like 10 out of the 14 prosecutions it's ever taken up have been with respect to allegations of African war crimes. There are jokes about how it's like the sub-Saharan, the Global South Criminal Court and not a generalized criminal court. And the ICC prosecutor, in his interview with Christine Amanpour earlier this week, where he announced the ICC's intention to pursue these warrants, even said, that he spoke to an American politician who all but said out loud, the ICC isn't for us. The expectation is it's for other parts of the world.
Of the individual is the protection of babies. I mean, these are fundamental American values that should engender bipartisan support. Now, of course, this situation, unfortunately, lies on the San Andreas fault of international politics and strategic interests. And of course, I've had some elected leaders speak to me and be very blunt. This court is built for Africa and for thugs like Putin, was what one senior leader told me. We don't view it like that. This court is the legacy of Nuremberg. This court is a sad indictment of humanity. This court should be the triumph of law over power and brute force. Grab what you can, take what you want, do what you will. And we're going to simply be, we're not going to be dissuaded by threats or any other activities, because in the end we have to fulfill our responsibilities as prosecutors, as the men and women of the office, as judges, as the registry.
So what should we take away from the fact that the ICC is now pursuing these warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant?
Yeah, it's a big question, and I want to preface too, like the focus of my own scholarship and teaching is in international criminal law, and the law of war, and as part of like my kind of scholarly trajectory, I've always have been and maintain a deep critical stance towards these bodies, and that includes the ICC, but other international criminal tribunals that we've seen kind of proliferate over the last 35 years or so. So, it's like a fraught endeavor for exactly the reasons that you just said, right? So folks on the left, critical legal scholars, et cetera, have long criticized the ICC in particular, but also these other institutions for focusing on the global south, both because those states and their leaders are just like weaker, but also as a way of furthering like imperial policies, using international criminal law, allegations of war crimes, etc., to basically target one's enemies. So law becomes this like political tool to go after one's enemy foes worldwide. There's a lot to that. Right. So I want to preface everything like within that. I'm not here to be like a celebrant or cheerleader for the ICC. That being said, like with the International Court of Justice in the South Africa genocide case, there's this huge amount of, excitement. On the one hand, I think it's fair to say, for folks who are concerned with like the fate of the Palestinians in Gaza in particular, but in general. So yeah, this is a debate within international legal circles and also kind of Palestinian activist circles, like what role should activism have for the International Criminal Court? What role can the ICC play? Folks have different ideas about that. Palestinians have been trying to get the attention of the court since like 2009, right? And it's one thing I mentioned in the thread. And it's been like 15 years of first trying to even get to the place where the state of Palestine could accede to the Rome Statute and therefore become a member state of the court. That happened in 2015, 3 years after Palestine became an observer state at the UN. So it's been like a long road. Since then, there's been an investigation at the prosecutor's office for several years, and not a whole lot has happened, right? It's only now with this extreme intensification of the violence, particularly in Gaza, that these arrest warrants are being requested. And so
that's an important point. If I could just pause you for a second, that there has been an investigation far preceding October 7th into potential war crimes claims against Israeli political figures. And there is, to the extent that you have a critical lens toward the ICC, I think that's an example as to why I think you're justified in that stance, that it seems to have required this incredible escalation since October 7th for there to be kind of a peep out of the ICC on this. Whereas for years, obviously, Palestinians have been regularly, killed. The lawn has been mowed, as it's been described. 2023 was the most deadly year for Palestinians prior to October 7th in recent history. And yet this court was basically resting on its laurels, sitting on its hands, as it were. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think that's important perspective.
Yeah, no, not at all. Yeah, absolutely. So, the temporal jurisdiction of that investigation goes back to 2014, right? So, basically, once Palestine became a state party, it then had the ability to refer its own situation. So this is a self-referral. It's the state of Palestine asking, and I keep saying the state of Palestine because that's the formal name at the UN that Palestine goes by, referred its own situation, in other words, crimes committed on its territory, but also by its own nationals to the court going back to 2014. And so that's the other really important thing to point out here. It's not as though the state of Palestine was requesting the court intervene only for the purpose of investigating and prosecuting Israeli leaders. It's been well known the whole time that any investigation and eventual prosecution would involve Palestinians as well, right? So that's something that was, factored into the calculus in terms of pursuing redress from the ICC, and that's what we see happening now is charges both for Hamas leaders and for Israeli leaders.
That is another interesting aspect because, as many listeners will already know by the time they hear this, one of the main sort of talking points that circulated since this news came out about the ICC warrants is that there are that Israel is being held to an unequal standard, that it is unfairly being compared, or there are quote unquote false equivalences between Hamas and Israel. And that it is somehow disrespectful to Israel as a quote unquote democracy to have charges or have these warrants levied against Israelis at the same time as they are levied against Hamas.
The president came out against that. The Israelis, even the Palestinians, have come out and said this is wrong. You have your own piece of legislation about the ICC.
Yeah, I do. It's an outrageous moral equivalence, which the president acknowledged, that tells you how far to the left the International Criminal Court has gone. I was disappointed that President Biden didn't also refute the underlying claims that Israel, for instance, has intentionally targeted civilians for killing or tried to starve children. The civilian suffering happening in Gaza, which is real, is happening solely because Hamas is using those civilians as human shields or props for international political strategies. I do have legislation that would impose sanctions on this rogue prosecutor and those in his office who have not just targeted Prime Minister Netanyahu now, but also in the past have targeted American soldiers as well. We're working with the Republican leadership in the House to try to pass that bill promptly and hopefully force Chuck Schumer's hand to bring it up in the Senate, because he also condemned the International Criminal Court today. But I would just say the only reason we have to pursue this legislation is that Joe Biden reversed Donald Trump's decision to sanction this very office and this very court in the past. This is a rogue court that Congress has previously given the president power to stand up to. Joe Biden hasn't used that power, Donald Trump did.
The outrageous decision by the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, to seek arrest warrants against the democratically elected leaders of Israel is a moral outrage of historic proportions. It will cast an everlasting mark of shame on the International Court. Israel is waging a just war against Hamas, a genocidal terrorist organization that perpetrated the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Hamas massacred 1,200 Jews, raped Jewish women, burned Jewish babies, took hundreds hostage. Now, in the face of these horrors, Mr. Khan creates a twisted and false moral equivalence between the leaders of Israel and the henchmen of Hamas. This is like creating a moral equivalence after September 11th between President Bush and Osama bin Laden, or during World War II between FDR and Hitler. What a travesty of justice, what a disgrace.
Let me be clear. We reject the ICC's application for arrest warrants against Israeli leaders. Whatever these warrants may imply, there is no equivalence between Israel and Hamas. And it's clear Israel wants to do all it can to ensure civilian protection. But let me be clear. Contrary to allegations against Israel made by the International Court of Justice, what's happening is not genocide. We reject that. We're going to always stand with Israel and the threats against its security.
And it almost feels as though the warrants against Hamas have been largely sort of erased, as though Israel is being targeted distinctly, as opposed to a kind of even-handedness that says, well, frankly, sure, we'll go after Hamas and we're going to go after you as well.
Absolutely. And there's Bree, there's so much to say there. My mind, honestly, I say this every morning. I'm like, okay, today is the day I'm going to not be surprised by whatever happens in the context of this conflict. And yet it's somehow it never comes true. So I've been thinking a lot about that over the last couple of days, that this claim. So, there is a script clearly that says exactly what you just said, right? So the response to this action by the prosecutor is to say it creates a false moral equivalency to compare democratically elected leaders and their actions with the, as Justin Trudeau said, the bloodthirsty terrorists who lead Hamas. So he actually used that language, which, is the language you would expect maybe from Biden. I'm not even sure if he went that far. He was probably more restrained, actually, or, someone like Trump. So, this is the script. Israel has said exactly that. Netanyahu himself has said exactly that. Biden has said that. Canadian officials, including Trudeau, have said that. UK officials, including Rishi Sunak, have said that. And German officials have said that. So that's actually, in some ways quite shocking because, for all of those states besides the US and Israel, right? So in other words, states that are members of the ICC and have been really important, kind of formative members, extremely important in the negotiation of the Rome Statute in the late 90s, in setting up the court, in constituting the staff of the court, in funding the court, all of that like material support that goes into making the ICC something that actually exists in the world. All of these states are hugely responsible for that. And yet we have them parroting this script that's coming out of Israel and the United States right now. And so that's like quite, it is shocking.
Yeah. I think it's also worth noting, as you point out, that when Palestine became a party to the ICC in 2015 and said it submitted, investigate Palestinians as well as Israelis, regardless of, who's committing the crimes, that also seems to be reflected in the response. I think a few months ago, back in January, maybe, when there was first news that percolated out that these warrants might be forthcoming, there was a statement, I believe, from Hamas that said, we welcome the investigation. Now, that can be a kind of pageantry and theater in and of itself. I don't mean to say that means there's no kind of moral and or ethical culpability there. But when you contrast that to the response that we've seen from Israel, which is earlier this month, again, when there was news that these that warrants were being pursued, I think at the first of this month, that Netanyahu came out and said, if you issue warrants against me, I will take it out on the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Obviously having nothing to do with the conflict in Gaza, different leadership, political leadership, and all of the rest. I will avenge. I will take revenge. And what we've seen over the course of the past few days in terms of the assault in the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank, the sniper attacks against children and doctors that have happened again over the last 2 days, it does seem like he's making good on that threat.
Mm-hmm. Also in terms of threats to withhold tax revenue, et cetera, right, from the authorities.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And this is just part and parcel of the wider campaign of collective punishment that, of course, predates October 7th, but has only intensified since then in the West Bank as well as in Gaza. The other thing I would say just on this point of moral equivalency is that, and the sort of obfuscation of the fact that actually the approach being taken here is even-handed or arguably lopsided in some, you could, because 3 Hamas officials at this point in time have been they were not charged, but about to be charged. And whereas we have 2 Israeli officials, right? So there's this kind of you can see that the prosecutor actually really carefully calculated, tried to put the thing together in a way that would appease critics or hopefully appease critics, while at the same time actually taking really meaningful action. So it's kind of a genius move, really, I think strategically from the prosecutor. It doesn't seem to have worked. And also on the sexual violence point, there are charges of sexual violence regarding hostages in captivity included. And the prosecutor has been very clear that investigations into sexual violence on October 7th continue. And I think we're likely to see additional charges and maybe even additional individuals included regarding that violence as well, with no mention, actually, of any of the allegations of sexual violence perpetrated by Israelis within the context of detention of Palestinians in Gaza. Now, part of that is to do with probably the material limitations of investigations in this context, right? So there's a ton of crimes that are being charged here. I think that's really worth pointing out. The prosecutor can't do everything, but he's really focused on sexual violence, as Israel wanted. Israel, that was part of the whole campaign, right, against UN women and the UN in general and the international community in general, was to say you need to pay attention to these crimes. Here we have the prosecutor doing literally exactly that. And the response is to say, this is outrageous, et cetera. And just very quickly, the whole approach to international criminal justice since the end of the Cold War has been what you mentioned earlier as even-handedness, has been, and that's been the thing that has given it legitimacy. So it's this idea that we're going to prosecute all sides to a conflict when they commit international crimes. We're not going just to prosecute, the most powerful states or entities who will end up winning a conflict. And Netanyahu's whole attitude now is to flip that on its head and say, no. The only legitimate approach here is that to actually do victor's justice and only prosecute one side, right? And that was the whole critique, obviously, of the Nuremberg tribunals. And so, we're really living in like an upside down world over these last days.
Yeah, look, I'm not expecting anybody else to commit to the argument I'm about to make, but I argued in a radar this week on Rising that to the extent that we're talking about false equivalencies based on just the raw volume of human beings killed and the raw scale of the tragedy, you could very much argue that it is inequitable to be even-handed about this, or to charge, 3 Hamas members versus 2 Israeli members of Israeli leadership, when you have on one side of the scale upwards of 35,000 people being killed by Israel versus 1,200 people being killed by Hamas. So to be responsible for kind of exponentially more harm and still be claiming that you've been unfairly persecuted here, it shocks the conscience, frankly, from my perspective. Moreover, I saw that Craig Mokhiber, who is the UN official who stepped down last year in protest over the UN's, at the time, kind of relative silence about what was going on in Gaza, he pointed out, to your point about sexual assault, that the charges against Netanyahu and Gallant should be modified to include forcible transfer, unlawful imprisonment, sexual violence, disappearance, apartheid, extensive destruction and appropriation, hostage taking, attacks on civilian objects and humanitarians, deportation, attacking protected buildings, mutilation, denial of quarter, pillaging, poisoning, gassing, prohibited weapons, outrages on dignity, human shielding, and a bunch of other claims. So really, again, it does seem, at least by this other, legal international law expert in Craig Mokhiber, that Israel has been undercharged here.
Yeah. So, that's like factually correct, right? So I think if you look at the Rome Statute and the crimes that are listed there, most of them, I would say, likely would be reasonable to pursue in the current context. The court does have financial and material limitations, and it needs to come up with kind of a structure for its case. And, part of decisions that are made by the prosecutor, pursuant to their discretion in terms of charging have to do with historically and through today, focusing on underrepresented crimes. So crimes that haven't received as much attention in the jurisprudence of international criminal law. Starvation as a method of waging war is one of those. And just for folks who haven't actually looked at the statement of the prosecutor or the expert report that was provided, the whole framework for the charges against Israeli leaders is through the allegation of a common plan to wage war through the use of starvation as a means to collectively punish the Palestinian population in Gaza. And so that's a particular framing, right? And that's a choice. But part of the idea behind that is to give voice and to create a jurisprudence in this relatively new area of international law around starvation as a weapon of war and what that means, but also as a broader framework, maybe down the road. And this is a kind of optimist in me with respect to international criminal law, maybe down the road as a way of setting the stage from an evidentiary perspective with respect to a potential charge of genocide, right? So the big thing that's missing in this set of charges is genocide, right? We have that at the ICJ with respect to the state, but we don't have genocide being charged against any individuals here. You know, a lot more to say about that, but certainly the core aspect of starvation is the deprivation, the intentional deprivation of items, objects that are essential to the survival of the civilian population. That includes food, but is not limited to food. It includes, like, you know, fuel, medicine, whatever, all these other aspects of humanitarian aid that are being withheld. And so the idea is, I think, down the road that this could really set up a future charge for genocide, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And as you were talking about the fact that the prospective warrant against the Israeli leaders is centered on starvation as a method of war, it's making me think about what also seems to be like a flood of stories or media appearances by pro-Israeli actors that has been specifically defending Israel against the charges that it is engaging in collective punishment and fomenting a famine. I saw that Eli Lake, who is notorious in this realm, wrote a piece for Bari Weiss's outlet titled "Study Shows Israel Supplied Sufficient Food to Gaza," trying to rebut these claims that there was deliberate starvation. It cites a study which has not been peer-reviewed and which doesn't actually, from a paper, quote, "Our findings do not reflect the actual food consumption of the conflict-afflicted people in Gaza. It's just a bunch of yada, yada, yada," hoping people read the title and don't read anything else. I noted that in a recent appearance of Benjamin Netanyahu with Jake Tapper this week, which we're going to get to into a little bit more in a bit, there is a big focus on Netanyahu refuting charges that there is a famine in Israel, in Gaza rather, and refuting the idea that Israel has been blocking the entry of aid.
We should note, though, it's not just the ICC expressing concerns about the lack of humanitarian aid getting into Gaza. President Biden and his administration and their officials, not to mention European allies of Israel and their officials, they've all been making this case for months that Israel is not letting enough aid in. So when President Biden expresses concern about you not letting enough aid in, is he wrong?
Well, no, we had the same concerns. We were trying to get the aid in. We got the aid in, and Hamas was looting the aid. That's what was happening. They were taking it for themselves or extorting the population. We were letting the aid in from the start. And look, this was my directive from day one. The day one thing was we have to provide, we comport with international law. We comport with the rules of war. We have to get those trucks in. We're getting hundreds of trucks every day in.
Even though, like, contemporaneously, we're getting reports about the extent to which civilians have been tipped off by members of the IDF as to when food deliveries were going to be made so that they could obstruct them. When we're seeing video of Israeli civilians throwing aid off of food trucks into the road. And when we just had new reporting that this over $300 million pier that the U.S. built to help get aid into Gaza, a pier, by the way, which wouldn't be necessary, obviously, if all of the entry points into Gaza, which Israel controls, allowed trucks in, hasn't actually resulted in any aid being delivered to Gazans. So, it does feel as though this is another, that, like, there's an understanding that this is a kind of vulnerability for Israel that it has to try to shore up. Because if the public does in fact believe, as most in fact do, that they are responsible for mass starvation, and in fact that is in itself a war crime for which there are now warrants, they're in significant trouble, both rhetorically and in terms of the public image, but also as individuals, Netanyahu and Gallant.
Yeah, totally. No, it's super helpful. So, and I think and this, this is speculative on my part, but it does seem as though there's like an attentiveness to this between the actions, the approach taken by South Africa at the ICJ, as well as the interest that was expressed by ICJ judges last week in the hearings regarding South Africa's request for additional provisional measures, its third additional request, around this issue of deprivation of the necessities for life. And so it's very clear, and it has been for some time, but more clear now, that the ICJ is quite interested in that as like a hook for decisions around genocide. And you know, the ICC prosecutor has focused on that as well. So it's a clear weak point. That's for a number of reasons. One, it's regarding like the entire civilian population. So while it's true that not, you know, I think famine now is in North Gaza, but not yet, although creeping into the rest of Gaza, you know, as we speak. It's true that starvation, like as a method regarding all of these essentials of life, is something that's directed against the entire population. So in terms of a victim class, like everyone is experiencing deprivation to a serious degree. In terms of the victim class, we're talking about like 2.4 million people, right? Which, you know, really covers the whole scope of the conflict, but also I think is quite, like, it's pretty accurate to the extent that we expect law, and there are debates about this, but to the extent that we expect international criminal law in particular to kind of get right the story on the ground in terms of what's happening. And it's hard to do that when you're, you know, I mean, you know this, like when you're looking at like a charge sheet and you're trying to explain what happened in the world, it's almost impossible to do that through a legal lens. And usually using the law to make those explanations will affect a whole series of intended or unintended distortions. So kind of getting it right, loosely speaking, is really hard to do. And I think looking at the nature of Israel's criminal activity in a way that can incorporate treatment of the entire civilian population of Gaza does that better than other approaches that would have focused, for example, on indiscriminate bombardment, right, would have done. So I actually think this is quite a smart approach.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and that's why we're seeing this kind of concerted defense exactly along those lines. I want to ask you, you mentioned that right off the top, that Palestine has been a party to the ICC since 2015. Now, some listeners might be shocked by that, given one of the narratives that initially was floated out after news of these warrants being pursued dropped. We heard this from Matt Miller at a State Department briefing. We've heard this from any number of members of the Biden administration, that this is a jurisdictional problem, and that whatever I might think, whatever the United States might think about Palestine's right to be a state or a two-state solution or any other kind of thing, this is simply not the jurisdiction of the ICC, because one, he argued that Palestine isn't a party to the ICC, and two, argued that Israel also is not. Now, Israel is not, but as people have pointed out, the same was true of both Ukraine and Russia when the ICC issued a warrant against Putin, was that around this time last year, and the United States' response was to cooperate with the ICC in providing evidence of Russia's war crimes in the Ukraine. What do you make of that?
Yeah. So a few things. So I think, you know, all indications are that these arrest warrants will be issued by the pretrial chamber. You know, sometimes at the ICC, there's been, you know, not all charges have been included in initial requests for arrest warrants, but, you know, all indications, as I said, I think are these particular arrest warrants will be issued. Okay. So once that happens, it's then open to Israel to make a series of challenges at the court, because we'll have a decision by the court to issue the warrants. It's a little bit different from how it works in a domestic system. It will be open to Israel, and I'm sure that we will see this, to make a series of defenses, essentially, not to the charges themselves, right? So not to the substantive allegations, but to the questions of jurisdiction and also admissibility, which are closely related, but also distinct questions within the context of the way that the Rome Statute operates. And so for the jurisdictional point, yeah, the short answer is that Palestine is a state for the purposes of the Rome Statute. I also, you know, the question of how an entity becomes a state is a complicated one, but there are a series of requirements that need to be met around population, control of borders, like international legal personality, that kind of thing. which are, again, related to but distinct from the question of whether an entity is like a member of the United Nations. So lots of different approaches to this in international law, but I think it's fair to say that from my perspective, Palestine is a state and has been a state for quite a long time. Many countries recognize Palestine as a state independently of anything else that's going on in the world, including 3 new ones, just today. And for the purposes of the International Criminal Court, it is a state party. Okay. That being said, there is some small, very, I would say, almost infinitesimal room for Israel to argue that Palestine, although it's a state party to the court, is not a state for the purposes of jurisdiction. So, I mean, this is a kind of a crazy argument because the idea is that you have to be a full-fledged state in order for jurisdiction to take effect with respect to your territory and nationals. So based on the jurisprudence of the court, this is extremely unlikely to succeed, mostly because in 2021, the court already decided that for the purposes of the investigation into the situation in Palestine, as it's called, the court does have territorial jurisdiction based on pre-1967 borders. So that's the jurisprudence we have, but that jurisprudence technically doesn't extend to the stage that we're about to enter, which is when arrest warrants are actually issued. So we're in this kind of like limbo stage, actually. And it's interesting that the prosecutor chose to go public with his application for warrants before they were actually issued as well. I think.
Well, why do you think he did? Because I have heard people say that the prosecutor Khan, that he is known to be someone who basically the Israelis liked, that was someone who was going to be kind of generally sort of sympathetic. Certainly not someone who's kind of in the pocket of big Palestine or kind of overly sympathetic to the interests of Palestinians. That he seemed to, when he was talking to Christiane Amanpour, kind of cited and named a number of, legal actors who are a part of making this application and pointing out how many of them are Jewish. I think at least one of them was himself a Holocaust survivor. Again, seeming to want to really build up the case against anyone who might think that he is under the influence or kind of in the bag for Palestine. So, I mean, I'm interested in your take on this. Why does he feel like he has to sort of insulate himself against that sort of criticism when he's announcing the application? And why do you think he made the choice to announce the application the way he did, with sort of a lot of fanfare for this sort of thing, I guess, with this big sit-down interview with Christiane Amanpour?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was, I mean, again, this is like speculative,
sure,
but my own sense is like, I can't speak for him, but he did actually say, so one thing that he did come out and say in his official statement was that this move, in his estimation, would contribute to the alleviation of suffering on the ground. And that what that really means is contribute to ending the conflict, right? So to getting to a ceasefire. So I think the idea is like pretty clearly that this would invigorate the already, building momentum internationally around pressuring Israel towards a ceasefire, right? So simply ending the offensive in Gaza. Israel and the U.S. and others, as we've already talked about, have really come out swinging against that. And I think it's up in the air how it's going to cash out in practice. But I think he wants this to, in part, contribute to peace. And that's part of the object and purpose of like the ICJ, or not the ICJ, the ICC in general. If you look at the, preamble to the Rome Statute, is that the whole institution, like the idea of prosecuting international crimes, is meant to contribute to ending conflicts and preventing them in the future. I mean, we can have a debate about whether or not that works in practice. That's a really important and large debate, but that's the stated purpose, or one of the stated purposes of the court. And I think the prosecutor is very clear about that. In terms of the folks you mentioned like Amal Clooney, right, is on this report. So it's a very like sexy list of, to the extent that international lawyers can be sexy, it's kind of a pretty sexy list of folks. So, you know, if you look at the list, it's, Amal Clooney, of course. And then you mentioned Theodore Marin, who's not only himself, he's 94 now, and he's not only himself a survivor of a Nazi labor camp in Poland, but former president of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in the 90s. So very, very, very eminent person, and of course, Jewish. So I think like there's a broader question like that legal experts are interested in around the use of this expert report. So, you know, the short story is the prosecutor has a whole set of special advisors that advise him on, you know, whether the applicable threshold is met. In this case, the threshold is reasonable grounds to believe that these crimes have been committed. He is perfectly entitled and authorized by the statute to make that determination himself, right? Like his office is entitled to do that. And yet he has these advisors that help him out. In part, I think that's to sort of show that, you know, to bring them in as like independent experts to sort of, as you say, help kind of respond to or dissuade allegations that the court is acting in a political way, because it has all these independent experts who are providing their, you know, assessment of the situation, applying the facts to the law, et cetera, and, you know, providing their own recommendations as to what to do. I don't know whether it's the case that these special advisors, you know, routinely provide the kind of report that we see in this case. Certainly that kind of report is not routinely made public in the way that this one was. And so clearly the function of that report is to bolster the position of the prosecutor, to show that the work of the court is even-handed actually in some way, or at least not directly influenced by partisan politics, but around a politics of peace building and an end to the conflict.
I wanted to come back and ask you about this Rome Statute jurisdictional issue, because we saw a couple of flare-ups around this with White House State Department spokespeople. In one, let me know if you've seen it. If not, we can play it for you. But Matt Miller goes back and forth with a journalist named Matt Lee, I believe. And Lee keeps asking him, well, who has jurisdiction here? You're claiming that the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction here. Who does? Who's supposed to investigate these crimes, any alleged crimes? Is Israel expected just to be asked again and again to investigate itself, the way that we've seen it has been asked to do so many times in the past, with no real accountability for anybody involved? And Miller at one point says, we have jurisdiction as in the United States of America. Did you see that exchange?
Focus on jurisdiction for a second. Who does have jurisdiction here?
So the government of Israel has jurisdiction
over the occupied territory. We have jurisdiction over Gaza, which is not entirely occupied.
They have jurisdiction into looking at the actions by their military personnel.
Palestinians, if they have a complaint, they have to bring it to Israeli courts.
We have jurisdiction, and we have with the use of our equipment.
I'm sorry. How do you have jurisdiction?
With the use of our military equipment that we have provided.
How do you have jurisdiction?
If you look at the Leahy law, if you look at
that's not jurisdiction in a criminal process. That's
not in a criminal process, but it has to do with the determinations that we make and the policies that flow from it.
Not jurisdiction.
But Matt, long term, you were right that we want to see.
You used to work for DOJ, Matt.
You were
on. There's no U.S. does not have jurisdiction.
There are different. I wasn't referring to criminal jurisdiction, Matt. There are different ways to look at this. Long term, we agree with you that the Palestinian people should be a state that has and have the ability to make these determinations. But that's not where we are today. That's where we're trying to get to.
You were fine with the ICC going after.
Go ahead, Humera.
Matt, what about the merits of the arrest warrant? You talk.
Can you make sense of that as an international law expert? Because I'm struggling.
I live for Mally. That's great. That's so good. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. So actually, it's really a smart response, right? Like from Miller, in the sense that Lee did ask about just jurisdiction in general. He was like, so legal jurisdiction, where does it lie? And he didn't say who has criminal jurisdiction and specifically who has jurisdiction over international crimes. And is there international jurisdiction over these international crimes, right? So yeah, so that's, there's lots to say there. So, okay, so the basic nuts and bolts, and this is the case, notwithstanding the fact that there will be challenges and it will get very technical, for folks who just want to understand like really the basic basis of jurisdiction and admissibility at the court. For jurisdiction, if the court will have jurisdiction over crimes that are committed on the territory of a state party. So in this case, on Palestinian territory, right? Including Gaza, obviously. By virtue of the pre-1967 borders, which has already been decided. Or over nationals of states parties. So what that means in this context is that anybody who commits a crime on the territory of Palestine, anybody, an American, an Israeli, Russian, all of these folks could be subject to ICC jurisdiction on the basis of territorial jurisdiction. There's also personal jurisdiction or nationality based personal jurisdiction. Okay, so that means any national of a state party can be prosecuted by the ICC for criminal activity that they commit on any other territory. Right. So that means in this case that Palestinians can be liable for acts committed not just in Palestine or on the territory of another state party, but also on Israeli territory. Right. And so really, I think what that says is that this works both ways. Right. Not only are Israelis liable here at the ICC, subject to the ICC's jurisdiction for crimes committed on Palestinian territory, but Palestinians are also liable for crimes committed in Israel or elsewhere. So that's really the basis. The basic point is that there is jurisdiction. We will see.
So what's Miller up to then? Because this is the other part that is so confusing. Because as I understand it, and do correct me if I'm wrong, neither Russia nor Ukraine are parties to the Rome Statute, right?
That's right.
But the ICC issued warrants for Putin. So now we're not getting the personal jurisdiction argument. We're not getting the other, the state as a party sort of jurisdictional argument. So what was the basis of that warrant being issued?
Okay, so Ukraine is a different kind of situation. So it's open to non-state parties to the statute. So to non-members of the ICC, and you're quite right, neither Russia nor Ukraine are members of the court. It's open to non-members of the court to voluntarily accept the jurisdiction of the court for defined time periods. And that's what Ukraine did. And that's called an Article 12.3 declaration that refers to Article 12 sub 3 of the Rome Statute. And so that's what happened in the Ukraine case. So Ukraine is not an overall member of the court, but it did voluntarily accept the jurisdiction of the court for the purposes of crimes committed on its territory or by its nationals.
That's so helpful in clarifying, because basically what's going on here is you have the State Department saying Palestine isn't a party, which it is, but also even if it weren't, it seems clear that we're in a context where Palestine is saying, yeah, hi, I want to be a party. I want you to investigate war crimes that Israel is committing in Gaza and frankly in the West Bank. And the United States is saying, well, we recognize that Ukraine, who isn't a party to the ICC, wants to have this temporary jurisdiction, but we're not going to recognize that Palestine, which in fact is a party to the Rome Statute, but even if they weren't, they are representing that they want to be, they want to have this ICC oversight. They want to have these ICC warrants issued, but we're going to just ignore that. Like that seems like a sort of even worse asymmetry now, given what you've explained.
Yeah, and it's a worse asymmetry for exactly what you're alluding to, which is that it really all comes down to statehood, right? It all comes down, for better or worse. Like I, again, as a leftist critical international lawyer, have a lot of critiques about statehood, borders, open borders, not having borders, all of that stuff. But it's a basic fact of international law that legal personality is premised on statehood, right? And so it's the continual and persistent denial of Palestinians' right to self-determination via their own state that is really the root of the problem here in many ways. And just quickly, too, like to talk about what Miller's response when he talks about Israel having jurisdiction. This is something that's called complementarity, which I know that you know about, and I'm sure folks have heard about as well. And this has got to do not so much with jurisdiction, but with whether the case is admissible. So it may be the case that there's jurisdiction, but that the case is not admissible. That's not going to happen here for the reason I'm about to tell you, but that can happen. There can be jurisdiction and yet a lack of admissibility. So complementarity means that the ICC is supposed to intervene as a court of last resort. It's only supposed to prosecute cases where the state who would ordinarily have domestic jurisdiction is unable or unwilling to prosecute a case. Okay. So what Matt Miller is saying is like, look, Israel has, and this is something that Israel pressed heavily upon at the ICJ last week as well, is to say, look, we have this like fully functioning, democratically mandated legal system. We have this fantastic Supreme Court that's very interested in applying international law, and in fact has been instrumental in kind of advancing what many liberals thought was the progressive development of international law over many years. That was the kind of liberal line. So we're fully capable of prosecuting our own soldiers when they commit crimes, right? We can prosecute our own bad apples. And in fact, we've done that in X, Y, and Z cases. That argument with respect to this set of charges would only work if Israel was pursuing an investigation, genuinely pursuing an investigation against Netanyahu or Gallant, which of course it isn't. So
yeah,
that's all.
And also, I feel like there's been a zillion and one cases of, whoever the soldier was that shot Shireen Abu Akleh, whoever it was. I mean, instance after instance of members of the IDF who've committed war crimes who have just been, shuffled to a different department, basically, when there's no accountability, no one's thrown in jail. And what is the stat about how many? I feel like there's some statistic about how almost like basically no soldiers have ever been held responsible for any of these crimes versus how many Palestinians you see rotting in administrative detention without any charges against them. I mean, it seems farcical to think that Israel was ever going to hold its own people accountable.
Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. So that's true, like systemically, as you've said, and with respect to this particular set of charges, it's clearly true.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, so their response from American politicos, now with the backing of Biden, is to say that we're going to respond to these ICC warrants by sanctioning the ICC. What does that mean?
So, yeah, it's a little unclear. There was a piece in the Financial Times from like last night or today about this. It's where I think Biden basically signaled an openness to pursuing what he called like a bipartisan approach, which is pretty worrying. So, and really there's very little daylight between Republican and Democratic positions on Israel. And this is part of that, right? So this is just a demonstration that I'm only laughing because it's so absurd. It really doubling down on impunity for Israeli officials' criminal actions is, my colleague Alonzo Gormindi said this morning on Twitter, it's a bipartisan project in the U.S. So Biden has said that he's open to that, but I think he said something like he wants to see proposals from Republicans to this, to this effect. I think those proposals are forthcoming. They might get voted on this week, apparently. But so there's an openness to agree to sanctioning ICC officials. Trump did this in 2020 in the last months of his presidency, and at that time there was an outcry from Democrats about what this means for the U.S. Kind of approach to human rights and international law in general. So even while the U.S. has always had a very frosty kind of relationship with the ICC in general, and never had any intention of becoming a state party, I don't think, still, as you said, it has supported individual cases where it has deemed that support to be, politically expedient, namely Ukraine and Russia, but others as well. So now Biden is open to basically doing exactly what Trump did, and maybe even doing it worse. So Trump sanctioned the former prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, and another official, which means that they, obviously couldn't travel to the U.S., that they would be subject to having their assets frozen, et cetera. They also... Yeah, and they also restricted visas for other ICC officials. That didn't last that long. Biden overturned it in 2021 when he came into office. But But that's what that means. Like, it's really sanctions. So in other words, sanctions are what so-called democratic states do to so-called terrorist organizations, right? So there are sanctions by Canada and the US and others against Hamas leaders. Those have been in place for a long time, as well as the leaders of other terrorist organizations. And so basically, actually, the false equivalence here, if you want to talk about that, is between the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and leaders of various terrorist organizations.
That's insane. So when we all roll our eyes when we hear Netanyahu or whoever say the ICC is Hamas, the ICJ is Hamas, everybody I don't like, the bully who beat me up in grade school is Hamas. But now this is constructively the United States government saying, in terms of how we treat people, we agree that the prosecutor Khan is Hamas, that the ICC is Hamas. Yeah. That is outrageous. Now, I have seen, again, I alluded to the fact that earlier this month, Netanyahu threatened retaliation in the West Bank against the Palestinian Authority if these warrants came through. At that time, the ICC warned Netanyahu that it's a crime in and of itself to threaten the independence and impartiality of the ICC. So what does that mean for America now if it wants to join Netanyahu and basically enacting some kind of retaliation against the ICC for upholding international criminal law?
Yeah, so I don't think it would be I'm not sure. I don't think it's any kind of criminal offense to threaten the independence of the ICC, but it's certainly, I don't know. I'd have to double check that. I don't think there's a way of coming up with that. But where it's really important, I think, in terms of responsibilities and duties, like, again, the U.S. is one thing. It showed itself as being just willing to die on the hill of fascism in Israel, right? Like that I think that's where we're at. But all of these other countries, Western liberal democratic, whatever states who are again, very important members of the ICC, those countries taking the position they have around effectively challenging the legitimacy of the court in general raises really serious questions about whether they are complying with their actual legal obligation to cooperate and lend assistance to the court. So that's what I'm worried about. And I think part of the riskiness of the prosecutor, we talked about this before, but going public right now is that as of yet, we don't have a decision from the pretrial chamber issuing the warrants. And so we're in this kind of like legal gray zone where states can maybe get away with saying that it's, extremely unhelpful, for example, to, charge Hamas and Israel at the same time. And it's like the nature of that allegation doesn't even make sense too, right? Like some folks have said, well, they just shouldn't have announced those charges on the same day, but it would have been okay if they were done on different days. So none of it really hangs together.
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm really interested in, and I'm so grateful that you're here to help unpack the kind of double speak around the jurisdictional argument, how it sort of exposes the extent to which there are layers to shield Israel of accountability, the sort of an extreme gaslighting of Israel arguing that it is being treated disproportionately unfairly at the same time when it's getting really a red carpet. I mean, even the delay between announcing that these warrants are forthcoming or are being pursued and the actual securement of the warrants seems to be almost a opportunity for Israel to right the ship, almost like a warning. I mean, we've been hearing some version of this is going to happen for at least weeks and I believe months. Opportunities for Israel to clean up its act, to stop the siege and to avoid these warrants being issued. And by the way, it's not as though this means, they matter and they don't matter. It matters insofar as, Netanyahu might want to travel to where he grew up in Philadelphia sometime and would be, well, I guess he wouldn't even be subject to arrest then, right? Because we're not a party to the ICC. So it's like, okay, so we can't go vacationing in Tuscany.
Yeah.
I presume Italy is the signatory of the Rome Statute.
It is.
Rome and all. But, other than that, it doesn't mean, because Robbie and I have been going back and forth about this on Rising a little bit, and he kind of balked at the idea that there might, being charged might create obligations for states to kind of invade other countries and arrest people because they've been convicted of war crimes. And I'm like, well, no, it just means that if you go into a state that recognizes that you've been convicted of this crime, you can be arrested. Because they respect the law. And interestingly, I did see this morning that Germany, despite making noises about not liking these warrants have been issued, said that it would respect the outcome and would arrest Netanyahu and the Gallant if they were to come to Germany.
Yeah, Germany has said both things, which is interesting. I think part of that has to do with the whole history of the Nuremberg and victor's justice, right? So, they don't want to. Maybe there are limits to I don't want to say they probably aren't, but maybe there are limits to German identification with Israelis. I'm not sure, but this might be one of them, right? And in part because of that like historical legacy and the fact that, they perceive themselves as like unfairly targeted and singled out, and they don't see the prosecutors doing the same thing here. So maybe the strategy has worked with regard to Germany. So Germany said both things. It said that it was a false equivalence, but also that it respects the court and would do what's required if and when. I saw someone joking on Twitter that it was like the tension between like the Germany can't help being a rule follower at the end of the day, as much as it is, Israel's greatest or second greatest ally. I think you're right, because of its guilt over the Holocaust, that at the end of the day, they can't break the German habit of just wanting to follow the rule. I know we're at an hour. Would you mind just doing a few minutes going through this Jake Tapper interview that I said we were going to analyze a little bit?
And let me tell you, I think that the numbers are also inflated. The UN, the UN organizations that are dominated by Hamas in Gaza is giving false information, as is Hamas itself. And people believe these numbers. The other day they came and said, well, it's about 35,000 who are killed, but 10,000 of those we said are women and children. Now we can't say that. We don't know who they are.
Whatever the numbers are, it's too many.
In the meantime, the lie circles. Well, look, yes, one is too many, but the reason they're there, the reason we have civilian casualties at all, is because Hamas is preventing them from leaving. I'm happy to say that in the Rafah operation that we've conducted, 1 million people actually left. People said, well, there are 1 million people, 1.2 million, in Gaza. Where are they going to go? They're going to be trapped. Well, 1,950,000 have already left, and there are very few civilian casualties because we're doing everything to get them out. This is our policy. It's humanitarian, it's responsible, we comport with the laws of war, and we're the ones taken to the dock. And it doesn't give any solace that they're also taking these killers of Hamas, these murderers, and putting them in the dock. As I said, Hitler's in the dock, but so is FDR, and so is Eisenhower. Absurd.
After 7 months of unity for your wartime government, there seems a lot of disagreement now about your plans for Gaza, or lack thereof, after a major military operations in Gaza is over. Benny Gantz wants a plan, or he says he's going to leave your government. Your defense minister, Yoav Gallant, says you don't have a plan. He's basically accusing you of trying to lay the groundwork for an occupation, either civilian or military, in Gaza in the future. Are you denying that the plan is for an occupation of Gaza, or are you taking it off the table?
No, I have a very clear plan. I think the first thing, the day after Hamas, Jake, is the day after Hamas. We have to get rid of Hamas, otherwise there's no future for Gaza, no future for peace, and it'll be a tremendous victory for not only for Hamas, but for the Iran terror axis that backs it and organizes Hezbollah, the Houthis, and all these other sundry terrorist organizations. So I think we have to defeat Hamas, and we will defeat Hamas. Rafah is the last stronghold of Hamas terrorist battalions. We'll defeat them. That ends the intense part of the fighting. But once Hamas is defeated, what we have to do is have sustained demilitarization of Gaza. And yes, on this, I think the only force that can prevent the resurgence of terrorism for the foreseeable future is Israel. At the same time, I want a civilian administration that is run by Gazans who are neither Hamas nor committed to our destruction.
So you're taking it off the table.
The third thing that we'll need to do is, no, I'm not. I'm putting it on the table, on the contrary. No, that's not true.
I'm saying you're taking off an Israeli occupation of Gaza. You're taking off the table an Israeli occupation.
If you mean resettling, if you mean resettling Gaza, yeah, it was never in the cards, and I said so openly, and some of my constituents are not happy about it, but that's my position.
All right, so I was surprised by even that little bit of pushback from Jake Tapper, kind of given his ideological priors. But what do you make of Benjamin Netanyahu there repeating this now debunked claim that the UN revised down its casualty numbers in Gaza?
Yeah, so I hate to say this, but like, I'd watched that clip earlier after you sent it, but like he's kind of a genius orator, right? You can imagine how if you were a person who was like steeped in a certain milieu and had, you know, whatever, like consumed a certain media flavor and, you know, wasn't particularly critical about the world, like this would just seem like convincing and natural. So it's like really shocking material. That's my first reaction. Secondly, I think that it's brilliant in the sense that what he's doing here, right? So he's and Tapper actually pushed back later on this as well, like that his talking points are calculated for an American audience, right? Like they're not for an Israeli audience or really anyone else. Like, I mean, he's on CNN obviously, but he's addressing himself to an Israeli audience as though he's like, or sorry, to an American audience as though he were like an American leader trying to convince his own electorate or something like this. And so he's saying essentially this talking point that we've seen since October 7th itself, which said that this is Israel's 9/11, right? And so, and therefore, where Israel is entitled to do with full American support, the full extent of damage that the U.S. Inflicted on the world in the 9/11 wars, which are ongoing, right? Which is absurd. So the first kind of proposition, politically and morally, is that it's totally fine to go around inflicting, like, irrespective of what the numbers or the ratio actually is, that it's totally fine to go around inflicting the level of societal and civilian devastation that was incurred and continues to be incurred as a result of the so-called war on terror, which is like a truly frightening proposition.
Yeah, and one that, frankly, people are pushing back against now. I'm not sure if you saw this clip that went viral with Lindsey Graham, where he basically made the same point at some congressional hearing. And when he said, basically, what do you want to happen next? The ICC to go after the perpetrators of the post 9/11 wars? And there was applause in the room. Like, yes, please, actually, we want our American war criminals to be held accountable as well.
So we, hopefully, together will find a way to rest our displeasure with the ICC, because if they'll do this to Israel, we're next. This group tried to come after our soldiers. Yeah, you can clap all you want to. They tried to come after our soldiers in Afghanistan, but reason prevailed. So at the end of the day here, what I hope to happen is that we level sanctions against the ICC for this outrage to not only help our friends in Israel, but protect ourselves over time. Mr. Secretary, your statement yesterday was excellent. The president's statement was excellent. Senator Schumer's statement on the floor was excellent about the outrage here. They have destroyed the notion of complementarity. They have misled people in the United States Senate about their intention, and they shall and will pay a price. Ms. Secretary, I appreciate what you've said. It is now time for us to act.
So I don't know how well that point is going to continue to land going forward.
Yeah, I hope it doesn't. Like, that would be great. In terms of like, yeah, and I think you're right. I think actual American real people don't share the views of the government, right? I think that's pretty clear. So that's my first point. But then this idea of, well, what was the original question? I've now lost it.
Just what did you make of the UN is Hamas and these inflated numbers, this argument that not as many people have died, and that the ratio, I think he also argues, of civilians to Hamas fighters is a good one, that they're doing a good job not having collateral damage.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, obviously, like that. So there is a horrendous amount of civilian damage. The major, again, irrespective of the ratio, there are like big debates about this, but with respect to other wars, but I mean, talk about like Vietnam, for example, or the Second World War as well. And and also Netanyahu explicitly later in the same clip says, if we were to agree with the proposition that Israeli leaders should be prosecuted for, at the same time as Hamas leaders, that would be like prosecuting FDR alongside the Nazis. And again, like one could imagine that you would hear applause in the room for that proposition, right? So anyway, so irrespective of the ratios, what's a little bit genius about this clip is that actually he doesn't repeat the same falsehood about the change in demographic breakdown by OCHA, the Office of Humanitarian Affairs at the UN, with regard to these numbers. So that was a huge debacle, of course, last week. And we saw lawyers for Israel repeating a version of that lie at the ICJ last week. But what Netanyahu does here is to say, well, the number, it's not that the number of deaths has been revised down. It's that the distribution or the demographic breakdown has been revised. And now the UN is saying it's not sure who these other 10,000 deaths are. And that's actually true, right? Mm-hmm. So in the sense that those deaths have not been subject to full
identification.
Exactly.
But I thought that was the point of the UN report anyway, that they were just saying it seems to me, and tell me if I'm wrong, that the stat that says 3/4 of the dead are women and children, which is something that you can identify without knowing who the people are. From skeletal remains, you can identify that, is what is suggestive of how many civilians have been killed. If you don't believe, if you believe that most Hamas fighters are men, and if you believe that children are not targets of war, legitimate targets of war, that's how you get to a place where, regardless of identifying any given body, that you're pretty confident in saying that the ratios of killed are disproportionately collateral damage. Moreover, when you get into that kind of 972 report about the AI generated targets and how the AI has this enormous acceptance of collateral damage, accepting up to 100 people, innocent people being killed for one high-ranking general, then it seems and add to that the use of some of these dumb bombs in dense civilian areas, you get to a point where it would be incredible if it weren't the case that civilian collateral damage was disproportionately high as compared to other conflicts.
Yeah, I think that's right. So there's no real any reason to suspect that that the breakdown that we have right now will shift once full identification has taken place, right? Now, Israel says that's not true. It says that Hamas is hiding the number of combatants killed in that 10,000. That's their argument. We don't have any reason to believe that or to think that. But the other really important point here that gets missed sometimes is around this question of like forced displacement, which again was also not a crime that included in the charges applied for. But Netanyahu keeps talking about Mosul and Fallujah, and hideous as they were, civilians could leave, right? Gazans have nowhere to go. Like they can't leave the borders, the sea on one side and the wall on the other. And so when he talks about, we're trying to get civilians out of harm's way, well, where is that? Firstly, they're not moved out of harm's way. That's a lie. And secondly, they're moved into places that are simply unfit for human habitation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that you did a really good job, frankly, addressing some of the major themes of that segment. And I think you're right that Netanyahu did a smarter job of entertaining similar talking points that we've heard more broadly, but avoiding some of the obvious pitfalls of being caught into an obvious lies that you've seen less able interlocutors fall into. I did find, and you alluded to this, Jay Tapper's bit at the end, asking him why he has been doing no domestic interviews in Israel, but has been a nonstop fixture in American press, was some interesting pushback.
Before you go, sir, we should note, while we appreciate your talking to us, according to the independent Israeli media monitor, the Seventh Eye, you've done about 24 interviews since October 7th, but all of them in English and all the outlets outside Israel. I don't want to begrudge that. I appreciate you doing an interview with us. But why are you not speaking with Israeli journalists the way you are with me?
That's the tendentious reporting of a lot of the Israeli media. So I can tell you what they're not telling you is I've done, I don't know if it's 24 or 20 or 15 press conferences with Israeli media. They can ask anything they want, and they do. And I just met Israeli reporters the other day in Rafah, in fact, 3 days ago, and they asked me all the questions they want. So that's simply not true. I speak to them, and I speak to you, and I welcome the opportunity to tell the truth and dispel the lies in both mediums.
And I'm struggling to understand kind of what motivated, maybe I'm misunderstanding Jake Tapper and his ideological priors, but it did seem to be an interesting question that gets to the core of, I think, an increasingly frustrated American public who feels as though there's outsized influence of Israel in our own politics, whether it's because of the challenge against people like Jamal Bowman or Thomas Massey or Pramila Jayapal's sister, who I believe was just defeated by an AIPAC challenge, that there is a growing sense that AIPAC is a foreign lobbying group that is unique. Again, talk about false equivalencies and disproportionate judgments here. That isn't asked to register as a foreign lobby group like everybody else, but who is increasingly open about its influence in American elections, talking about how they're going to lobby American representatives to try to sanction the ICC, for instance, and that just being an open thing that's happening that is not looked at with the same kind of scrutiny as, let's say, Russian interference, which has been a front page story for at least since 2016. So, It's I guess good to see. I don't know, what did you make of that, the end of the interview there?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, look, he has to look like he's objective in some sense, right? So on the one hand, it's like a theater or a performance of even-handedness or objectivity, but on the other hand, like for American self-perception, the freedom of expression and the free press kind of concept in general is like foundational to democracy, right? So there's it's a really important broader point about, is Israel actually a democracy? So Tapper didn't actually come out and say that, right? But that's really what the question is. And so, and clearly no. And partly because of restrictions on press freedom that we've seen recently, is like with the outlawing of Al Jazeera. I think recently
the AP
material. Yes,
camera.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So all of those incidents combined with this idea that Netanyahu is not actually making himself accountable to his own electorate, really,
and postponing elections in the first place.
Yeah. Exactly.
Not allowing people.
And the whole thing, like before, like let's not forget, before October 7th. There was huge unrest and discontent within Israeli society around Netanyahu's attempts to restructure the Supreme Court, right, and the authority of judges. So this is a much deeper question about like the viability of Israel as a democracy.
Yeah. I will say also that while I think you're right that he massaged the numbers talking point, he did repeat the beheading and raping of women talking point.
And they vowed to commit the October 7th massacre, this horror of beheadings and raping of women, beheading women after they rape them, the burning of babies, the slaughter of the innocent, the taking of hostages. We'll do that again and again and again.
At around the same time that it came out that the woman in question, Shani Luke, her family just came out this week saying that they had received her body and that it was, not beheaded. Obviously, it's a tragedy that she's dead. It seems grotesque to have to keep talking about, it wasn't as bad of a tragedy as Netanyahu or whomever is saying, because, I don't want to diminish the underlying loss here, but that her body was intact, that it looked, quote unquote, beautiful. And you have the family saying that about their loved one at the same time that you have the prime minister of your country spreading falsehoods about her having been decapitated. It's a really sick, twisted world we live in. But I'm really grateful for you, Professor Matthews, for joining us here today and walking us through some of the legal intricacies here. I was particularly interested in your commentary on what has been going down with Matt Miller at the State Department. God help him if you ever end up in a press briefing room. I'll say that. Heidi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Bree. This was great. Thank you.
Where can people find you on the internet and beyond? Feel free to point to anything you might have written recently, et cetera.
Sure. I'm writing a few pieces now on the question of the ICC warrants, coming out in The Conversation and a couple of other outlets. And on Twitter, I'm at Heidi __ Matthews with 2 T's.
Awesome. Thank you for joining. Thank you for listening, all of you in the audience. If you want an extra dose of bad faith every single week, you can subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast and not only get episodes on Monday, but also get a over 300 episode backlog. I was listening to a podcast recently that said they had been going for 8 years and they were kind of patting themselves on the back for having over 300 episodes. And I was thinking to myself, you've been going 8 years. I've only been going about 3 years and I have 300 episodes. It's because I don't take vacations, and maybe I should, but that's not the point. What I'm saying right now is that I hope you appreciate the abundance of content that you're getting out of Bad Faith. And I really appreciate those of you who support us over on Patreon. Take care of yourselves, and as always, keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you, and as always, keep the faith.